This is lecture number 12, The Rise of Mass Democracy between 1820 and 1840. The title itself, Mass Democracy, that means getting more people, the masses, involved in government, right? That's what democracy is. That's what this picture is over here to the right. So let's talk about before this period when it comes to politics or American version of democracy. Well, wealthy white males dominated politics. Wealthy white males voted. This is what America looked like. So when we talk about the trend under this lecture, the rise of mass democracy, another term, a synonym, we can call it the rise of new democracy in America. Look at the dates. It's not going to be women and people of color. When we talk about the rise of new democracy in America, we're talking about common white men. Another term that's used in AP US history, universal white manhood suffrage. Suffrage is a term that means voting, the right to vote. We're going to see an era in American history, about 1820 to 1840, where the common white man will be included in the democracy with the ability to vote and even elect leaders that try to carry out some of their interests. We're going to see this rise of new democracy in America. Some of the causes. Why did the wealthy elite open up to the masses to be more involved in politics and voting, etc.? Some of the causes would include the Panic of 1819, because remember the victims here were the poor white farmers, and they blamed the wealthy elite Eastern banker. So the common man was demanding more representation. So this was a cause of this movement. The common white man wanted more representation. Another cause of new democracy, the whole issue of slavery. When we talk about the Missouri Compromise, slavery is going to begin to divide America, North and South. So, the wealthy leaders in the North and South, they needed voting power. They needed votes. So they're going to open up their elections, their politics to the common man to fight this fight over slavery. And another cause of a new democracy is that really elections and candidates, it's going to become a popular thing to be involved in. And we're going to go back to two parties. And when you have two parties competing for voting power, they're going to open their doors to anybody and everybody that can help them win elections. So this is the movement of new democracy in America between 1820 and 1840. And of course, the results of it. In the election of 1824, leading up to this election, if you remember, we have still one political party that was dominant, Democratic Republicans. Although we see candidates representing, different interest groups. In the election of 1824, you had John Quincy Adams running. You had Henry Clay running. And then you had the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, running. And Andrew Jackson spoke like and represented the common man from the West. In the election of 1824, neither of these candidates got enough electoral college votes to become the president. So this standstill in the election of 1824, it was left up to the House of Representatives to decide who would be the next president. Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House, so he was eliminated from the competition. But you see, Henry Clay is very influential being the Speaker of the House. So whoever he supports would win the tiebreaker. Whoever he supports, the House of Representatives would name President of the United States. And this, you can say, got a little shady because Andrew Jackson had the most actual votes. But Henry Clay got the House of Representatives to support the election of John Quincy Adams. And adding to the controversy, John Quincy Adams, after being named president by the House of Representatives, appoints Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, the man who really won the election for him. So to Andrew Jackson and his supporters, this shady agreement, this agreement that looked unethical, they called the election of 1824 the corrupt bargain because of this bargain made between Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. As president, John Quincy Adams began to see division in America. Like I said, some of those issues from the era of good feelings are now going to be very obvious. John Quincy Adams and Congress is going to support a new tariff. What some in the South especially would consider a high tariff on import goods. This tariff of 1828, the Southern states would call the Tariff of Abominations. So when we talk about America, the North generally was supporting this tariff, but the South was very much against it, even though, again, we still have one political party. In fact, John Quincy Adams, vice president, a very vocal politician from the South, and this would be his picture down here. John C. Calhoun, he always kind of represented the South. He is going to write a protest to what the president supported. He's going to write a protest about the Tariff of Abominations. The name of his written protest would be called the South Carolina Exposition. A vice president criticizing the policies of a standing president. At the end of John Quincy Adams' first term, Andrew Jackson would receive more and more support as more people moved out to the West, especially the common man. You can say what happens next is a result of New Democracy, is a result of mass democracy. This time, when Jackson runs against John Quincy Adams, as Quincy Adams runs for re-election, the Democratic-Republican Party is very split. Andrew Jackson would refer to himself as a Democrat, and John Quincy Adams would refer to him as a national Republican in this election. But this time, John Quincy Adams would win the presidency, largely on the backs of the common Western man. It was referred to as the Revolution of 1828 because of who he represented, that common man in the West. Andrew Jackson had the nickname Old Hickory. As president, he would be very controversial, and his actions, his policies are still debated today. On the more negative side, when we look back at Andrew Jackson, he was very much guilty or accused as president using a spoil system. A spoil system is where you reward your political supporters with government jobs. Remember, there were a lot of common men in the West that supported him, sometimes not the most educated or qualified for government jobs, but he rewarded a lot of his popular supporters with government jobs. This is a spoil system, whether they were qualified or not. Another criticism of Andrew Jackson's presidency, he had a group of advisors that were unofficial, not approved by the Senate or anyone else. He had a group of advisors that met with him, that kind of talked to him about public opinion, and they got the nickname the kitchen cabinet. People were implying that he met with him, while drinking coffee or having a meal in his kitchen. And everyone questioned, who are these men? They're not elected, they're not approved. I hope they don't have that much of an influence on American government. So these pictures to the right was the old hickory. This is supposed to be his kitchen cabinet. And this is a picture, a cartoon, criticizing his spoil system down here. Andrew Jackson would soon find himself, just like John Quincy Adams, in the middle of a tariff controversy. A new tariff was put before Congress, and the expectation, especially from the South, was there would be a drastic reduction in the tariff. Jackson and Congress instead did a minor reduction in the tariff, one that still angered the South and the southern states. The South, especially the state of California, was threatening nullification. The state of South Carolina was calling for other southern states to nullify the tariff. That means don't honor it, don't pay it. This idea of states going against his presidency greatly angered Andrew Jackson, and he was threatening to send troops into South Carolina to force them to honor the tariff. Well, the great compromiser from the Senate, I believe is appointed in the Senate, is going to try to fix the situation. I'm talking about Henry Clay. We remember him in the compromise, the Missouri Compromise. He's going to step forward to try to prevent any drastic action with the compromise tariff of 1833. Another reduction in the tariff that would try to keep everyone happy, a minor reduction in the tariff that would try to keep everyone happy. It was enough for Congress to approve. It was enough for South Carolina and the South to step down. If you look over here, the senator from South Carolina, John C. Calhoun, was squaring off against Andrew Jackson concerning this nullification crisis, or the threat of nullification. And while Andrew Jackson agreed to the compromise, he also sent a message by passing the force bill, where he warned South Carolina or anyone else that the federal government has the power to use troops to force people to honor a federal law. So while it was a struggle, he got out of this nullification crisis. Now, a goal of Andrew Jackson's, especially because he represented the man of the West, one of his goals was to kill the Bank of the United States. And he set forth just to do that. Now, understanding killing the Bank of the United States isn't, throwing our economy, our money into a disaster. It's just finding a different way of storing and using our money. He openly criticized and accused the director of the National Bank of corruption, a man by the name of Nicholas Biddle. And there's different cartoons and pictures out there of how, again, he was coming after Nicholas Biddle. Andrew Jackson used his power of the presidency to kill the Bank of the United States. And really the way he weakened the Bank of the United States is by using pet banks. He used a pet bank scheme. The money collected for the federal government, he started sending to smaller state banks instead of one large federal Bank of the United States. He started distributing, again, our money, our revenue, our tax money into small banks to lessen the power of the Bank of the United States. And he's also going to veto the renewal of the Bank of the United States, which would, in a sense, kill the Bank of the United States. Economically, Andrew Jackson is also remembered for Specie Circular. As people were growing out to the west, and as the banks were trying to get people loans and trying to get people to buy land out west, there was a lot of crazy things happening with our money supply, including, some of the banks and states creating their own currency. Well, in order to prevent another terrible panic, another depression, Andrew Jackson passed Specie Circular, or basically a law that said you can only buy this land in the West with hard money. And that hard money would be gold or silver. It wasn't popular with the West. Even the Westerners that elected Andrew Jackson, but he did this because he believed it had to be done to prevent future recessions, especially in the western area of America. Another agenda of Andrew Jackson, and when we talk about the bank, just looking back at Andrew Jackson, when we talk about the bank, this is going to divide people. Okay, a lot of Democratic Republicans still believed in the bank, especially those that lived in New England, the old Federalists. So that's going to divide people, politicians within the political party. When we talk about the tariff, that's really going to divide the North and South in America. So we see more and more division during Andrew Jackson's presidency, which we'll get to in a second, what that's going to lead to. Another policy of Andrew Jackson was a policy in which he supported the removal of Amerindians, or Native Americans. He is known for getting Congress to support the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which called for the forced removal of Indians in the southeast over here, because we already cleared out the northwest to come to the Battle of Tippecanoe, the tribes of the southeast, to forcibly remove them and relocate them to the Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma, far from their land and not with the best conditions. This was his agenda. In the 1830s, over 100,000 Indians were forcibly removed from what was their homelands to the Indian Territory. The natives tried to resist, and one way that they did that was through the Supreme Court. We're going to see Supreme Court challenges whether the president and Congress had the authority to forcibly remove natives. There was a Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. They tried to appeal the Cherokee Nation that they were like a foreign nation and they had the rights to their lands, that they did not necessarily have to follow the laws of America. Well, the Supreme Court ruled against the Cherokee Nation, ultimately ruling that they had to comply with the forced removal. And then there was Worcester versus Georgia, which seemed like a victory for the natives. Worcester, I believe, was an American that lived within the Cherokee Nation, and the state of Georgia had arrested him and demand, they show allegiance back to America. And the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of Worcester, saying that he had rights while he was living with the Cherokee. But Andrew Jackson refused to help Worcester, refused to honor the ruling of the Supreme Court. So Andrew Jackson allowed Georgia to force Worcester out of the Cherokee Nation, even though the Supreme Court had ruled he had rights. So even though the Supreme Court, in a way, supported the Native Americans, it was obvious that the president would not. A terrible event that would happen with this whole agenda would be called the Trail of Tears, which actually happened in 1838. The Trail of Tears was when 18,000 Cherokee were sent on a 1,000-mile march from the southeast to Oklahoma, forcibly by American soldiers. The elements were terrible. The resources were not enough to help them. Over 4,000 natives died in the Trail of Tears in this fourth march to the Indian Territory. Now, this development has nothing to do with Andrew Jackson, who really wasn't part of his presidency, but it happened during this period, and it's going to affect America very soon. Away from America, we're going to see the birth of Texas, because Texas was not part of America in its early history. The background to Texas. Stephen Austin, an American settler, had an agreement with Mexico to create a settlement of Texas that would have a lot of American immigrants. As the settlement of Texas grew and they began, the Americans practicing things that the Mexicans did not give them permission to, like engaging in slavery. Mexico demanded for its territories to have Catholicism as its main religion. When the dictator of Mexico thought that Texas was not complying with its agreement, Mexico was dead set in once again controlling Texas. Texas declared its independence in 1836. Sam Houston was the commander of the Texan army. We remember the Americans lost. It was a moral, in many ways, a moral victory, how the brave Texans stood for the Alamo as the Mexicans overran it and defeated them. Sam Houston's forces defeated the Mexicans, actually defeated the Mexican dictator, and Texas became an independent nation, became a republic. 1836. Now, early on, and most people knew, because the Texans were largely Americans, that the Texans wanted to be part of America. Andrew Jackson, well, he was not involved in this whole dilemma. It took him a while to recognize Texas. He kind of avoided dealing with Texas because politicians at this time knew in 1836, 1837, Texas joining America would create division in America. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about what would be obviously a new territory with slaves. In the election of 1836, this is after 2 terms of Andrew Jackson, a number of American politicians that really despised him, that really hated Andrew Jackson as a president and criticized him. We look at the picture to the right. This is a popular picture. We see a torn up constitution stepping on it. They thought he abused his powers. He vetoed a lot of the congressional powers. Okay, he even had the nickname King Andrew because he vetoed Congress more than all the other presidents before him combined. For those that really opposed him, by the election of 1836, we saw the creation of a new political party. They were called the Whigs. So we're now down to two political parties. Again, two political parties that will last a while now. The Democratic Republicans, you take off the Republic, you just have the Democratic Party, the party of Andrew Jackson. And now you have the Whigs. Who were these Whigs? Well, the old Federalists, New Englanders, supporters of the American system, industrialists, merchants, evangelicals, nativists, some of those that were against the immigration that was taking place. The election of 1836, William Henry Harrison was the candidate of the Whig Party, and Martin Van Buren was the hand-picked successor by Andrew Jackson to be the Democratic nominee. In this election, Van Buren would win. However, he would only serve one term. He would not be as popular a president as Andrew Jackson. When you look at Jackson's legacy, again, there's a lot to talk about, discuss, and debate. You go back to the spoil system. Some saw him as an authoritarian with his veto power. Some saw that he showed good leadership during the nullification crisis. It's debatable whether his campaign against the National Bank was good for America. Specie circular. Obviously, his campaign against Native Americans has looked negatively on American history. So there's a lot to discuss when it comes to President Andrew Jackson's legacy. Like I said, shortly after Van Buren became president, we're going to go through another economic recession, the Panic of 1837. And many blamed the dismantling of the National Bank on the Panic of 1837. The poor economy is what's going to cost Van Buren a second election. In the election of 1840, Van Buren runs for re-election against, once again, William Henry Harrison. The slogan of William Henry Harrison when he ran for president, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Because William Henry Harrison was the hero of Tippecanoe, and his vice president was one John Tyler. That was the Whig ticket. And in the election of 1840, the Whigs would win the presidency. A lot of themes from this lecture, a lot of themes. First of all, mass democracy, new democracy. The era between 1820 and 1840 has been called the rise of mass politics. Analyze the causes. What caused this rise in new democracy? Were there any groups that were left out during this period? Number two, identify the goals and philosophies of Jacksonian Democrats, especially, domestic affairs, economic goals, etc. To what extent were Jacksonians successful in achieving these goals and implementing their philosophies politically and economically? Number three, compare and contrast the goals and philosophies of the Democrats and Whigs, also known as the National Republicans. Number 4, to what extent did the Jacksonian era lead to more sectionalism? That's North and South. And let me tell you, it's not, sectionalism isn't just North and South. Sectionalism is North, South, and West. Okay? So always think about the West too. This one specifically says more sectionalism between the North and South, between 1828 and 1848. And the last theme, analyze U.S. government, our policies when it comes to the natives. Analyze the U.S. government, in case you can't see the bottom, the U.S. government's policies towards the Amerindians or natives between 1828 1838.